Hi everyone, my name is Andres, and today I'm going to be talking about some of the challenges in understanding decentralization in DAOs and some initial steps we've taken towards tackling this problem. So as we're all aware, are ubiquitous in the blockchain ecosystem and come in many different forms and for many different purposes. So we have DAOs that manage DeFi lending protocols, behave as community-run investment funds effectively, support gaming guilds, jointly collect iconic NFTs, and even DAOs that attempt to buy copies of the Constitution. And on top of this all, we have even more bizarre DAOs, like DAOs for people named Dave for some reason. So even though DAOs have wildly different purposes, sizes, rules, and I guess degrees of seriousness, they all share three kind of core principles which are helpfully baked into the acronym. So the A in DAO has a quite clear meaning, namely that their execution is sort of automatically enforced by smart contracts that are on blockchains, as we all know. And DAO is a basically self-evident term. They're organizations. The most obscure property, in my opinion, is their decentralized nature. What does it even mean for a DAO to be decentralized? And I think we all have a sort of intuitive understanding of what this means, a sort of kind of collective community agreement of what we mean by decentralization and why it matters. But I think there's a gap in a kind of robust academic understanding of DAO decentralization like we have for other parts of the DeFi ecosystem. So a proper understanding of decentralization is, of course, a very important problem. Since decentralization is this sort of axiomatic ideal that these communities strive for, we could ask a number of important questions, such as how can we increase decentralization? How does the decentralization of DAOs compare across each other? What are voting mechanisms that increase decentralization, and so on? But before we can even ask these important questions about decentralization, there's a sort of necessary precondition, which is how do we even accurately measure decentralization in the first place? And this is really a kind of necessary precondition in the sense that how do we know that we're even investigating the right thing if we don't have a kind of clear understanding of measuring decentralization? So prior work has sought to answer this question, and roughly these take a similar flavor, where we compute some function over the distribution of tokens across account balances. So concretely, maybe we compute a function like Gini coefficient or like Shannon entropy over how tokens are distributed across individual accounts. And while this is a good starting point, it has some important gaps, which I think were kind of alluded to in some of the prior talks. So in particular, these approaches are insensitive to a few important things that may be going on in a DAO, which affect its true degree of decentralization, whatever that means. So for example, the DAO may seem quite decentralized when in fact one entity is the owner of many of the accounts, or the majority of the accounts, for example. Or it may seem to be quite decentralized, but in fact, most people don't even vote. So decision-making is just concentrated amongst a few number of people, and we have the presence of this kind of large, let's call it inactivity whale, that's not participating in governance. Or the DAO may seem decentralized when in fact a third party paid everyone to vote a certain way and influence the outcome of the elections. And we have even more subtle examples, like perhaps since votes are generally public in DAOs, there could be social pressure to vote a certain way due to, say, reputational risk of voting for maybe an outcome that's not socially preferred. So this is an example of kind of centralizing forces that affect governance. So as we can see from these examples, voting power in DAOs may seem well distributed according to distribution over accounts, but in fact, perhaps token holders are sort of acting in harmony as these abstract voting entities that are really driving the governance process. So this raises an important question. How can we measure decentralization in a way that we capture these, let's call them centralizing forces, and get a sense of the true degree of decentralization in DAOs? So this is a kind of starting point for the work that I'm going to talk about today. So in particular, today we're going to introduce a new decentralization metric framework that sort of captures these centralizing forces. And I'm going to show how we can use it to derive formal insights about decentralization, and perhaps more importantly, how we can use it as part of empirical measurements of decentralization. So our new metric is called voting block entropy, which we pronounce VIBE. And as we will see, Vibe is an attempt at really like first principles approach at decentralization. And we aim to almost like tautologically capture these intuitive notions of decentralization that I mentioned earlier and these like centralizing forces that are hard to see or completely missed by looking at like individual accounts. So Vibe is based on one kind of very simple premise, which is that instead of thinking about decentralization in terms of individual accounts, we should be measuring it in terms of the abstract voting entities that are really driving the decision-making process, as I was saying earlier. And we formalize this notion of aligned voters based on aligned utility functions. So we say that two accounts or two token holders are part of the same voting clique, voting block, if their utility functions are aligned in some sense. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a sec. And if you think about it, the sort of centralizing forces that I was alluding to earlier, they sort of abstractly all do the same thing, which is alignment of utility functions towards a particular outcome. So for bribery, basically it's paying for alignment towards the briber's desired outcome. Social pressure is alignment towards the socially preferred outcome, whatever that means, and so on. And really, I think this is kind of the main contribution of our work, this conceptual idea, kind of the mental model of governance as alignment of utility functions instead of individual accounts. I think this is the kind of key point of this work, to be honest. So to be more concrete, the Vibe model is a two-step approach. First is a clustering step where we partition the set of voters into blocks. It's sort of the standard term in the voting literature, or cliques of aligned voters. And this alignment is a function of their underlying utility functions. And then once we have these like blocks of voters, we just compute some entropy function over the distribution of tokens now across the blocks of aligned voters. And of course, this general recipe can be instantiated with arbitrary functions, essentially. So Vibe is, in fact, a framework where the clustering algorithm just partitions the set of players based on their utility function, so it's just a equivalence relation, I guess. And then the entropy metric just computes some function over the tokens held by each equivalence class. And I'll be a little bit more concrete about these parameters in a second. So now I'm going to move on to how you can actually use this framework. So a first kind of critical observation is that, of course, utility functions are so-called latent variables, meaning we cannot directly measure them, let alone cluster based on utility functions. What does it even mean to have even know your own utility for a particular election outcome? So then what is the point of all of this? So there's two use cases that we're going to highlight in this talk. The first is that even in the presence of utility functions, Vibe and the kind of Vibe lens serves as a good theoretical tool to reason about how policy choices directionally influence decentralization. So whether in broad strokes they increase or decrease decentralization. And from this we can derive practical guidance. And the second use case, which I'll get to in the second half of the talk, is that even though we cannot measure utility functions, we can of course estimate them via observable data, perhaps voting history, for example, from which we can approximate Vibe using the framework I discussed earlier. So this is kind of going to be the roadmap for the rest of the talk. So yeah, so I was saying earlier, even in the presence of utility functions, we can estimate the direction in which a policy choice may impact decentralization. And the intuition here of these results is this mental model I was saying earlier of whether a particular policy choice causes alignment of utility functions or divides a clique of aligned voters. And I'll show three examples here of kind of this intuition in practice. In the paper, we have more examples and really the kind of formal results, but I'm going to leave the details aside for the sake of the talk. So as a first example, let's look at delegation. So intuitively, you might expect that delegation increases centralization since most people are handing their voting power to these delegates that effectively may behave like larger and larger whales. However, when looking at it through the lens of Vibe, what may actually be happening is that these tokens are coming from an even larger conceptual whale, namely this, what I refer to as this inactivity whale, this blob of apathetic voters that are effectively acting as one voting clique that I guess doesn't vote. So the result is that delegation may, in some cases, actually increase decentralization, namely by splitting this larger whale into, which again is an abstract whale, not a literal whale, into smaller clusters, namely the cluster of each delegate, which may actually be a good thing. So this first lesson is that when there's a big inactivity whale, delegation may be a good thing, may actually increase decentralization. The second example is voter privacy. So what does privacy have to do with decentralization? So a well-understood problem or well-known problem in voting is this phenomenon known as herding, which is that people tend to vote in alignment with their peers or with like influential community members or so on and so forth. And this is well reflected by this quote from this recent Sharma et al. Paper. I didn't want to vote against the proposal just because my reputation would be on the line or something. This is a common phenomenon we see, that the public nature of blockchain voting or DAO voting makes it such that people converge in, as I was alluding earlier, socially preferred outcomes. So the fact that people need to worry about their reputations creates some alignment in their utility functions towards what society deems to be less bad for your reputation. So the lesson here is that ballot privacy may actually increase decentralization. By letting people vote for their legitimately preferred outcomes, the impact from the point of view of Vibe is that it's breaking off this like social whale or set of social whales and letting people vote according to their true preferences. And again, I know this is all very high level intuition, but in the paper we show this formally how the Vibe framework implies decentralization. And the third example I'm going to talk about today is the case of bribery. So the most intuitive relationship between bribery and decentralization is that bribery increases centralization, which is of course very clear, similar to the prior two examples, namely aligning voters towards the briber's desired outcome, so creating a larger and larger clique of voters, which would be reflected in the Vibe formalism. But a second observation, which I think is more interesting, is that as decentralization increases, in fact, the risk of systemic bribery also increases, so the risk of large-scale bribery. And the idea behind this result is that in a DAO that's very centralized, decision-making only involves a few large whales calling the shots who can kind of like cut backroom deals and coordinate among themselves. Whereas in a very centralized DAO, a very decentralized DAO, to really influence election outcome, you need to affect the results of many ballots. You need something that can buy the votes of many individual voters. And in the paper, I'm just going to say this very briefly. In the paper, as sort of an orthogonal contribution, we show that systemic bribery, so whenever hopefully DAOs become very decentralized, systemic bribery is going to be a real threat due to these dark DAOs, which are basically mechanisms for fair exchange when it comes to vote buying. And in the paper, we show the first practical implementation of these in Oasis. They have been theorized before, but if I have time, I'll come back to say a little bit more about them, and in particular mitigations, which I think is kind of the key question there. Those are just three examples, and we have more examples in the paper, and from those would derive kind of broad strokes practical guidance. And I want to emphasize a point that we're not really saying anything new in many of these cases. I think we all know that bribery is bad for decentralization. So really the contribution here is to show that this Vibe, very basic first principle for decentralization, agrees with some of the kind of intuitive notions that we have for decentralization, not the results per se. So now I'm going to move into, and I'm running a little bit tight on time, but I'm going to talk about how we actually compute useful stuff with Vibe. So as I was saying earlier, we can obviously not cluster based on utility functions, since we cannot even measure these to begin with, but we can estimate them via a reasonable set of so-called observable variables. The most obvious example being just plain old voting history. So we can assume that depending on how you voted, at least tells us the direction of your utility function at the minimum. And based on this, we introduce a second concept, which we call observable Vibe, where we represent each utility function based on some observable data, again, think voting history, and then we cluster based on this vector of observable data. So just as a quick example, we could have each player, their utility function across a set of elections be estimated by a vector of votes. Then we just use some kind of textbook clustering approach based on this data, maybe k-means or hierarchical clustering or something like that. And then based on the size of each class, we just compute the maybe like min entropy or Shannon entropy. Really, the instantiation is kind of outside the scope of the main framework, but this would be one such example. So what can we do with this? So the first obvious thing would be to just actually measure and monitor the decentralization of DAOs. So we agree on a set of observable data, let's say just voting history, and one way to instantiate the framework, let's say k-means and like min entropy, for example, and then we just periodically compute the vibe of DAOs. So as a work in progress, we are, which I'm not going to show results, and I'll say why in a second, we are working on a large-scale empirical study of the vibe landscape, let's call it, where, and here I put simple instantiation, meaning we're just using voting history for estimating utility functions. And we're not considering any other sources of data for now. And the reason why I'm not showing results here is because we are very recently, first of all, this is work in progress, and second of all, we're hopefully very soon, publish a dashboard with a bunch of different DAOs and their vibe, I guess, and how this is a screenshot of an internal prototype and how it fluctuates across time and the different clusters that are being formed and toggleable parameters of like the windows and so on and so forth. And we're also going to have in the bottom left, it's very small, but parsing of proposals using LLMs to try to identify which clusters favor which types of proposals. So here we have like game development, technology, and so on and so forth. So it should be public sometime soon. And this is computed using k-means. And I'll get to qualitative results if I have time at the end of what we've found so far. And the second use case that we think is interesting is using it as a signal metric for governance experiments. So for example, we want to test a hypothesis regarding decentralization, say, how do private ballots affect decentralization? And then we can simply measure the vibe of a control group versus a test group, and maybe one has public ballots, one has private ballots, and we compare like their delta vibe, if you will. And of course, there's a lot of like methodological questions that I'm glossing over, such as like controlling for other factors and so on. That's the basic idea. And as a proof of concept, we're working on a vibe-based experiment for RetroPGF, which I should stress that this is very much in the design phase, and we don't know when or even if it'll be part of future rounds of RetroPGF, but this shows the flexibility for even different voting schemes. As you all know, RetroPGF is not binary votes, but rather like allocations of funds across projects. And some initial simulations on synthetic ballots have shown alignment as we would expect. How much time do I have left, Sarah? Okay, cool. Okay, then I will skip this for the sake of time, because I want to get to kind of future steps. So just to summarize, kind of bring it home for a sec, the kind of core contribution of this work is this mental model, first principle approach at decentralization of what really we mean by decentralization, which again is this notion of alignment of distribution of tokens across abstract voting entities as per their utility functions. And this kind of tautologically captures centralizing forces. This framework is highly configurable to be used with different clustering algorithms or entropy functions and so on. And we showed how, on one hand, you can use it, just a basic formalism, as a formal tool to reason about how decentralization is affected by certain policy choices. And on the other hand, we showed that in fact, or we discussed that in fact, we can instantiate the framework with like concrete algorithms, concrete observable data, and do useful stuff such as tracking vibe, doing governance experiments, and so on. So this is kind of the main contributions. And as I said, we're work in progress. Gonna put out a dashboard with the vibe of many DAOs, which hopefully will be exciting. And then I want to touch briefly on the next steps, because I think there's two kind of key questions that we're working on. The first is, of course, how can we better estimate utility functions in the context of DAOs? We're kind of here doing the trivial thing of just looking at voting history. Could we use, for example, like social media interactions? Could we use cross-DAO analysis, so on and so forth? So that's something we're very interested in. And perhaps I think the most intriguing question is, how can we not to sound redundant, but how can we reason about vibe itself? So what I mean by that is like, how can we, in a principled manner, determine which of two clustering approaches is better, right? Like, how can we say, for this DAO, Shannon entropy is better than cosine similarity, let's say. I don't think we have a good grasp at answering those types of questions. Or even say, like, why is this set of data that we picked a better estimate of utility functions for vibe? I think we really need kind of a prior formal framework for voting as a philosophical thing, I guess. So this is really where most of our energy is at the moment. And really, I don't have guidance in terms of how you pick actual parameters for the framework for the time being, outside of just run experiments and use your own knowledge of your community, I suppose. So that's kind of what we're working on at the moment. But yeah, that's all I have for y'all. Thank you.
Any questions?
This is a super interesting paper. I'm wondering about the dynamics. So alignments might not be stable, obviously, especially because you have, these are tokens, so you have the base of voters is not stable. And you could get really weird things like, it looks like everybody's aligned, but they're aligned to decentralize the DAO, and that brings in a whole bunch of new token holders. And then I'm wondering if you've thought about the dynamics and how you deal with the fact that an alignment is maybe temporary.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. We have thought about it, and even to expand on what you asked, you could even ask, like, what if we're just aligned because like all proposals are like clearly great, right? And that's sort of the questions we're trying to answer with this kind of more formal prior framework for Vibe itself. And the model as a first principle is very simple. We don't consider we're just considering a snapshot of elections where we assume like a static population of token holders, which is of course a simplifying assumption. So this is to say that your question is definitely on our roadmap. And broadly, to kind of close the loop, we are thinking of how to enrich the model to account for things like organic centralization from just something obviously benign and good and stuff like this. So that's an excellent question.
Any other questions?
I really like this research, by the way, congrats. I was wondering if you've done have you done any other cross-DAO Vibe analysis already, or is that yet to come? And on top of that, are you considering at all any money-weighted utility functions? Because there might be a chance in which, yes, there's 10 DAOs, 9 of them are super decentralized, but only one of them holds most of the money. So then the overarching system does favor that one overcapitalized DAO's utility function, which is what we see usually in a lot of, also as someone that also gets paid by DAOs, right? I always try to be aligned with the ones that have the most capital, even though they might not be the one that will be the most decentralized.
Yeah, that's, we hadn't thought about that. I'll start with the second question. We hadn't thought about that. I think it's a very intriguing idea. Yeah, we'll be happy to chat about it offline because I think it's very, very interesting idea. And for the second one, for the first one, sorry, how to compare Vibe across DAOs. This is the second point I had skipped there. We still don't have an amazing answer for how Vibe is sort of like you would sort of like medical like heart rate, where it's more useful for like self-comparison of how you're fluctuating, but it's not clear how you would compare kind of apples to oranges, the Vibe of different DAOs, which by the way, this is a limitation of any decentralization metric for that matter, in the sense that you have so many parameters, like how many people are in the DAO, their size, their dynamics, the types of proposals. So even though you can, of course, like agree on a set of parameters and compute Vibe for different DAOs, we're kind of thinking of how to basically normalize across DAOs for the various different factors. To do more useful cross-Vibe analysis, which basically, just for you to have a sense of what we're thinking, kind of trying to reason about all the factors that could influence Vibe, such as I said, like how many members they have, like the types of proposals, so on and so forth, and somehow basically like divide by all of these conceptually to normalize in some sense. But yeah, that's indeed something on our roadmap. Yeah, thanks for the questions.
All right, let's thank the speaker.